Hey guys, Chop here. 3.7 is fast approaching, and the livestream for this version teased the first Fontaine character, Charlotte. It even showed Fontaine itself, granted it's underwater so you can't really tell, but still, we've seen it. It's a whole new region with its own plotline and a whole lot more to theorise on. This video is going to explore what the Archon quest of Fontaine may be, using evidence from trailers, in-game hints, and real-life potential counterparts. I'm hoping that this will be the most accurate speculation on Fontaine's story and characters that there can be in 3.6. So, let's get started. Let's go back to the beginning. No, not that beginning. That beginning. The Archon War. Fontaine will have been ruled over by a Hydro Dragon sovereign before the rule of the Primordial One, who had to leave and make way for the gods. There are likely many gods that fought for the throne, before the victor was decided and the first Archon of Fontaine was chosen. This Archon eventually perished during the Cataclysm, with her corpse becoming the Amrita pool. We'll call this god the Lord of Amrita for the rest of the theory. Following their death, a new Hydro Archon was chosen, Focalors. She's the god of justice, Hydro, and the current Archon of Fontaine. That's a very surface level look at the history of their godhood, but what does Fontaine itself actually look like? It's the most modern nation in Tevat, filled with engineers creating new and fanciful mechanisms. You can think of Belobog from Star Rail, but instead of snow it's water. This much we know from various events, including people from Fontaine or visiting Fontaine, but they also speak of other traits that are very important to acknowledge. The first is that the waters have become polluted and the air is toxic, as well as Liben telling us that there seems to be a social instability and unrest among the people. The final 2 points I want to mention at the beginning here is that there is a huge energy crisis with their current supply of energy quickly depleting and every engineer trying to find a new solution to it, as well as the Oceanids being a product of the Lord of Amrita, tasked to connect the world but have since separated from Fontaine as they do not support the current Hydro Archon, Focalors. These are perhaps the most important details for us to use as our source before theorizing. However, there are two huge major lore drops outside of the game that we need to consider as well. The first one is the Tevat Travail storyline preview, which says this about what Fontaine's Archon quest will be about.
The god of justice lives for the spectacle of the courtroom, seeking to judge all other gods. But even she knows not to make an enemy of the divine.
The name of the Fontaine Archon quest chapter is revealed in this, with it being named Masquerade of the Guilty. Now, this is all extremely cryptic and almost impossible to extract any truths from without the other information we have. The chapter name is suggesting there is a falsehood or pretending of those who are guilty in Fontaine. The quote from Dainsleif basically just says that Focalors enjoys the show that a courtroom puts on, perhaps less so than the actual true justice that it should pertain. She wants to judge all other gods, but not incite the wrath of a Celestia. I think the easiest points to take from this analysis is that the courtroom is likely corrupt, essentially putting on a show or masquerade to cover up that they are the ones who are guilty. Her wanting to prosecute other gods, though, is very odd, but probably means that she doesn't agree with the Lord of Amrita, which is why the Oceanids have abandoned her, because she doesn't agree with their god. Her being afraid of Celestia also probably means that her laws are incredibly strict and in line with the heavenly principles, and she may realise that other gods don't follow these laws quite as well, so she wants to essentially prosecute them. Okay, so that's the Travail trailer information, but we also have the Nymph Stream artifact set that tells us probably more than anything else when paired with Reen's nose. Throughout all of these notes and lore, we learned that Canria had used a material known as azosite as an energy source before the Abyss, which some people from Fontaine, Reen, Jacob and Elaine, learn about. It's a pure elemental energy that lacks a will, which the Abyss does have. The plan was for them to return to Fontaine and research how to separate the Abyss power from its will, so that they can use it for energy. This was around the time of the Cataclysm, so it has been a long time since then. So long in fact that Elaine, whose second name is Guillotin, founds the Fontaine Research Institute, which looks into researching machines and energy. The artifact also goes on to say that Reen was corrupted by abyssal powers that they presumably tried to harness, leading to Elaine having to kill them. Because of this, Elaine swore that he would make a kingdom powered by machines and energy that is separate from the elements. However, that last part is inferred, not openly stated, and so it may not be entirely accurate. However, given the energy issues that Fontaine has, it's very likely that this is true, because this is a good reason for them not to be using the abyssal powers now. I think the final important piece of information before we're finally done is that there is a director and vice director of the Narzissenkreuz Institute, but both of them died in the cataclysm. The director was said to have a great deal of hydro energy, so they may have been the Hydro Archon. Oh, and Narzissenkreuz is German, strangely enough. It means daffodil cross, which will be important to remember for this theory. Whew, that's pretty much everything. It's a lot of details to keep in mind and remember, so I'll remind you of them as we go along and piece it all together. The key things to consider is that they include these hints and limited events that disappear before Fontaine is released for a reason, as well as that the nation is based on friends, which we can garner from the nation's name and people's names being of French origin. I do know that there is one name of English descent, but it's very minor and contradictory to the rest of the information, so I'm counting it as an outlier for now. I'm also going to be working with the theory that Hoyoverse based the fundamentals of plots and lore on real-life counterparts. For example, Inazuma's whole plot of the Sakoku Decree closing their borders and the Vision Hunt Decree taking away their visions is based on their counterpart nation in the real world. Japan had a shogun back in 1635 that enacted the Sakoku Edict, which is a decree that closed their borders. It's a pretty close equivalent to Genshin, but the story is then its own from this basis. My assumption from here then is that Fontaine will be based on a big moment in France's history, and their story will go on its own from there. So, what's one of the biggest moments in France's history? I think the most obvious answer is the French Revolution, which can make for an extremely exciting plot for the game. It's certainly the biggest moment in France's history that is unrelated to wars, at least. Or as unrelated to wars as one can get in the 1700s. There is decent evidence to support this hypothesis, with the biggest one being Elaine Guillotin, founder of the Fontaine Research Institute, who is based on a real-life guillotine, which is the man who suggested a new way to execute people that is less painful. This device is the infamous guillotine. He didn't actually invent it, by the way. He just proposed that there should be a new method and people named the guillotine, made by somebody else, after him. There are 3 other smaller indications for the French Revolution. One being the basis for the story is a time period being the Industrial Revolution, which is not long after the French Revolution. Another indication is that Liben told us about the social instability and unrest, which is the beginning of the French Revolution. Finally, the Narzissenkreuz Institute I mentioned before, which translates to daffodil cross, has a daffodil in the name, which is a flower that symbolizes rebirth and renewal, which obviously is pretty close to a revolution. So, in Fontaine, a revolution is happening because of a social instability, and the ones who are guilty are hiding behind a show. This is what we get from the French connections and the Travail preview. So, what's this revolution about? What social instability is there in Fontaine? Well, we're yet to talk about the energy crisis, pollution, oceanids, and Focalors. So, let's bring them into this. We know that the city is polluted and the water's impure, which is probably due to their energy crisis and lack of oceanids. Oceanids are capable of purifying waters, which we learned from Endora back in a 1.4 event. So, with their disappearance, perhaps the energy source that Fontaine uses and that is depleting is polluting the waters and no longer being purified by the oceanids. Presumably then, there are 2 sides in Fontaine. Just like how Sumeru had the Academy versus our team in Sumeru, Inazuma had the Shogun's army versus the Resistance, etc. So, the 2 sides in Fontaine must conflict with resolving the energy crisis to fix the waters and air of their city. This brings about the revolution, with the Traveller being on the side aiming to clean the steampunk-esque city against the guilty group that are pretending to be something else. This is probably going to be done by changing the energy source to something new and sustainable, whilst also bringing the Oceanids back to purify the waters. Ultimately, it'll be a civil war with a revolution against the establishment. There's one major piece left then. Where does Focalors lie in all of this? All we really know about her at the moment is that she is terrified of Celestia, likely due to her predecessor falling because of the Cataclysm and seeing what Celestia does to nations that don't follow their laws. Because of this, she's made Fontaine a nation with sinless people, which is indicated by the Varanard Lazarite gemstone description. I think this is going to end up quite similar to Inazuma in principle, where Focalors is forcing her people into being something they're not in an attempt to appease Celestia, but we have to teach her to change and let go of that, to rule Fontaine with a new notion of justice. The court is going to be corrupted with this notion that hinders the people, perhaps in the sense of their energy problems more than any other. I would imagine that Elaine Guillotin's influence of finding energy that is not elemental is going to be the ideology that inspires the enemy group in the next nation of Genshin. Their attempts at finding this new energy source aren't working, but another revolting group has found an energy source that works, elemental energy. Focalors, as well as her court, are afraid of this elemental energy source and so reject it, but we have to teach her that it's the way forward and not to be afraid of Celestia. This would result in the new energy source being chosen and used, the Oceanids come back to help purify the waters, and the current court being either overthrown or more likely just changed. Before I look at the other plot points that we can theorise on to work around this overall basis for the story, I want to look at what characters we can expect to see released. The guaranteed ones are Focalors, Charlotte, and Lyney and Lynette, who are the two characters we see featured for Fontaine in the Travail trailer. Focalors obviously will be Hydro, and Charlotte seems to have an animo vision from what I could tell in the trailer. Also, Lyney wears some red, so he's probably Pyro, and Lynette wears a turquoisey colour, so she's probably either Hydro or Animo. In terms of other characters we may see, they're very likely to be in important positions that we will meet in the story. So almost certainly a judge, maybe even the head of justice in the court, probably the leader of the revolution, some revolution members, an engineer probably as well, someone important in politics or just generally influential like somebody who's rich, and the rest are likely just random industrial professions, journalists, photographers, train conductors, ship captains, that type of job. I do think that we're going to see two conflicting sides from the nation that most characters will belong to. Some won't be involved at all, especially once the Archon quests are over, but I think that's where the first few patches of Fontaine will focus their characters on. Expect a Hydro Claymore user, because we don't have one yet and this is the Hydro Nation, a Geo 5-star because we haven't had one since Ito all the way back in 2.3, and more Dendro characters, because they're obviously still trying to fill out that roster. The designs will all be very steampunky and industrial era inspired, so they will all wear hats and big overdramatic clothes. Okay, back to the lore of the Archon quests itself. I know I've already mentioned the general idea of it, but I've not mentioned the Fatui, Abyss Order, or Hexenzirkel yet, all of which I think will show up in Fontaine. The Fatui always show up in each nation, so which of them will appear in this one? Well, given that there's still 8 Harbingers left to deal with and only Fontaine and Natlan left before Snezhnaya, I think it's fair to assume that we'll be seeing at least 2 Harbingers as we usually do. There tends to be a theme of one surviving and one leaving, but which 2 could these be? The best place to look initially is the power rankings. We defeated La Senora with no help at all back in Inazuma, who is ranked as number 8 among the Fatui. We've also defeated Scaramouche, both of us with the power of godhood. I'd suggest us less than he though, and so therefore I think the Traveler is stronger than number 6, Scaramouche. So Alicino, Pantalone and Sandrone should all be beatable. Personally, I think that Alicino is the most likely of these 3 to be in Fontaine, mainly due to her lack of loyalty to the Sarisa, which Chab mentions, her ability to transform into a powerful state of madness being perfect for the Fatui weekly boss, and a comment she made in the Winter Nights Lazo interlude teaser. Pulcinella and Pantalone were talking about La Senora's passing, but Alicino said that they didn't understand the pain of dying in a foreign land, because they don't leave. They stay in Snezhnaya, whereas she leaves, which means that she has to be in either Fontaine or Natlan. Given that she's the second weakest Harbinger, I think it's fair to assume we will see her sooner rather than later. With Alicino showing up and likely becoming a playable character after we turn her against the Sarisa with the final push she needs, I also think that her monstrous form will be a weekly boss. So who's the other one then? The Harbinger that will get away. We've already seen Dottore and he may come back, but I see no reason to. He was only really in Sumeru because it's his home and he was experimenting, so what business would he have in Fontaine? I think it's unlikely, and Piero being the big bad of the lot is almost certainly not showing up until Snezhnaya. That just leaves Colombina, Pulcinella, and Il Capitano, who are above Scaramouche. Pulcinella doesn't leave, as Alicino hints at, so I think it's more likely to be Colombina or Il Capitano. Both would be really cool and fitting in a masquerade ball, but Il Capitano is one rank down and is said to have a strong sense of justice, which matches up well with the nation of, well, justice. There is Sandrone as well, who's in between La Signora and Scaramouche, but again, if we're able to beat Scaramouche, then Sandrone shouldn't be able to get away from us. So I think that both Arlecchino and Il Capitano will appear in Fontaine, with Arlecchino becoming a weekly boss, playable character, and turning against the Cerisa. Il Capitano, however, will manage to retrieve the Gnosis from Focalors and return it to his homeland. It's ultimately pure speculation on how he gets it from her, but given that only Venti has had it forcefully taken from him, I think it's safe to assume that Il Capitano will get the Gnosis through more political means. Perhaps even being awarded it as compensation in court, it being deemed justice for the guilt Focalors feels after her own crimes against the people of Fontaine. That's the Fatui side of Fontaine's story, but what about the Abyss Order? Honestly, they've been really useless for a long time now. In Mondstadt they were a big deal, even corrupting Dvalin, but ever since then they've not done much. In Sumeria they never did anything at all even. All that happened is us learning of how they formed. We might get some further hints of the identity of the Sinner, given that the Traveller and Paimon will undoubtedly ask Dainsleif about him since it was the last time they met. In 3.6, we did also learn about Dane's snake ring, which I made a whole theory on if you're interested. I somewhat doubt though that we'd actually get to learn more about it, because it was basically just hidden away in a world quest and wasn't openly said. It's far more likely that we just progress with trying to find the Loom of Fate, now knowing that it's related to the Sinner. We won't get the Loom of Fate or probably even see it, but we'll probably learn more about it. I do actually want to connect this somewhat to the Hexen Circle, which is what I think the interlude chapter Archon quest will be about. Now that we've had an event on it, Hoyoverse should be ready to include it into the main story. We ended Sumeria's Archon quest with one of the Hexen members, Nicole, talking to us, so I think we'll meet her in Fontaine. Her name is of French origin, so it completely makes sense to see her here rather than anywhere else. Her specialty is dealing with fate, so we may even see a link up with Nicole and Dainsleif for the Loom of Fate quest. Ultimately, if Sumeria's takeaway was memories, then Fontaine's takeaway will be fate, which is one of the biggest themes throughout Genshin Impact. I strongly doubt any other Hexen Circle members show up. Hoyoverse wouldn't really want to overwhelm us with a new concept of players that didn't experience the event, so I do expect to only see Nicole teaching us about fate and us using that knowledge with Dainsleif. I do want to throw in some random speculations that only hold merit in basic extrapolation rather than well-evidenced theories, but because it's a much different tone to the rest of the video, I'm going to sum up the theory now with how exactly Fontaine's Archon quest will go, and then I'll speculate afterwards. We will arrive in Fontaine through Chenyu Vale, which will be a beautiful nation filled with deep water that we can dive in. Once we get to the city though, the pollution and toxic water will be disgusting. Everyone in Fontaine that we meet at first will seemingly have full faith that the issue will get resolved, with the court system seemingly to work amazing. But as we get deeper into Fontaine, we learn of some underground resistance in the sewers, which is something we've been told are complex and detailed underneath the city. They want to replace the energy source to an elemental energy, but the politicians of Fontaine and the Archon Focalors won't allow it, so we have to devise a plan to expose the establishment as a falsehood. That will be the first two acts in 4.0. 4.1 will have acts 3 and 4, where we learn about the complications with Focalors and the Oceanids, trying to encourage them to return and heal the waters, as well as probably showing up to some masquerade or theatrical show which we can use to take down the establishment. Finally, 4.2 will be Act 5, where we manage to convince Focalors that Celestia's laws are corrupt and to change her judgment. We manage to convince Arlecchino to switch sides in this update, with her seemingly being the Fatui enemy working in the courtroom before this, but Il Capitano swoops in and convinces Focalors to hand over the Gnosis as compensation. We'll get an interlude chapter with Nicole coming in and introducing the Hexen Circle to us officially, as well as more information about fate. This is before Act 6 comes about and Dainsleif returns to team up and do nothing probably. We might learn more about the Loom of Fate and Nicole may join us, but we'll almost certainly learn about who the Sinner is, which I made a video on if you're interested in, by the way. It'll all conclude with the energy crisis averted using the revolution's proposed idea, the justice system overhauled and updated for the better, and Focalors become a better Archon to her people and the Oceanids. All the evidence throughout this theory points to some variation of this idea. I've informed you of where these hints are and walked you through what I think they mean, but it can easily be interpreted differently and may be different to what I'm suggesting here. I would call this a theory still over speculation though, because of all the evidence I provided. However, I do have some speculations that I think will be fun to throw out. Firstly, many people have predicted Celestia finally getting involved, which I sadly don't really believe. I think they'll be mentioned more in this region, especially by the Archon, but I don't think they'll get directly involved. Yes, Celestia is the main enemy of the game, but they are going to be the enemy once we've dealt with the Fatui. They won't come into direct involvement until we reach Canria, because we can be pretty sure that the Traveller defeats the Fatui and not Celestia defeating them. If Celestia was to wake up now after a dormant 500 years, then there's no reason for them to not just stop the Fatui now. So I don't think we see them directly, just maybe learn a little bit more about them. Additionally, I want to mention the Sovereign Dragons. Apep says that some died and only left bones, others became friendly with people, and the rest fled. We've not seen any bones of dragons, unless Arabashi counts, but I think the imagery of a sovereign's bones being left fits best for Natlan, so I doubt the Hydro Dragon is dead. They're probably chilling in the sea. Whether they're friendly or not, I really have no idea though. I'd assume so, just because we're running out of nations where there could be a friendly dragon, unless Apep really does mean Dvalin and Ajdahar, but they seem a lot weaker than her. Something else I think is important to mention is the location, which we know to be north of Sumeru and attached to Liyue, so it's probably in this area here. Based on the map dimensions and area remaining, Natlan is likely south of Sumeru and west of Inazuma, with Snezhnaya just taking the whole top of the map. I think that Fontaine will genuinely be huge, but you can't really have a lot of water in Genshin, because it's so boring. That's why they're adding the new traversal mechanic, diving, which we know needs a license to do in Fontaine. With this being the case, seeing an underwater village would be amazing, and it is now possible. I would love to see that, and it would be really unique, but it is a little hopeful, and we have no reason to believe it yet, other than it being a good way to fill the underwater area. For the geography of Fontaine, it will likely be mountainous in half the region and flat in the other half, very much like France. Waterfalls everywhere, rivers, lakes, forests, etc. It's super hard to predict what their special subregion will be like though, because you could have never predicted Dragonspine for Mondstadt, the Chasm for Liyue, or Enkanomiya for Inazuma, just based on the nation's real life equivalent. So I won't. We've got underground times 2 and the desert and snowy mountains, so perhaps we could see an underwater area or underwater cave for Fontaine. Anything in that regards. They could have an ancient civilization like Atlantis, probably making it an ancient Rome-inspired subregion, which I think would be super cool and could be used to dish out a bunch of lore. That's pretty much it though for the current speculations on Fontaine and its Archon quest. I'm bound not to be completely accurate, but I do think that a lot of the evidence I've presented to you does point to a story somewhat similar to what I've suggested here. In the final updates before its release, I'm sure we'll get some big hints towards this. If there's anything big that drastically changes what I've theorized on here, then I'll make an updated video on it. But hopefully I'm right with just this theory. And if I get even half of this right, by the way, I want you to believe every word I say from this point on, even if it's stupid and ridiculous. Anyway, thank you for watching, and it would be nice to see any thoughts you have on it in the comments. Let me know what you want to see and what you think we will see in Fontaine, especially in regards to its Archon quest. That's all from me though. Chop out. Bye.